morning. I think we'll have plenty of other folks hopping on here in just a minute, but we'll get started right at 9 like we said, and I'll turn it over to my colleague Vicki Riggs with Soil and Water.
Hi, Dearborn County Soil and Water wants to thank everybody for attending today. And John Hawley, I want to especially thank him with Dearborn County Purdue Extension for making this possible. Usually this time of the year, we're outside in the ice, sleet, snow, rain, so this makes it nice that no matter the weather, we're going to be able to stay warm inside. Our first speaker is Alex Russ he's a lake management supervisor from Jones Fish in Cincinnati, and we'll turn it over to him to get started. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Vicki. Let me share my screen here so I get the presentations open. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Looks great, Alex. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm going to break this down. I'm going to have 3 separate presentations. We're going to touch on algae and weed identification and treatment practices. We're going to do some information on some stocking rates, species, for this area. And then we're going to do the last presentation on aeration, fountains, that sort of stuff to keep oxygen levels high in the pond and everything happy and healthy. So we're going to start right out of the gate here with algae and aquatic weed identification. So this is a really great tool to kind of the really basic species that I see on a very regular basis when I'm out in the field. We get the most questions for these species and a little bit of treatment information, but mostly identification. And that's always the first step to identifying your problem is, okay, what are we dealing with? And then the steps that we need to go forward to keep that under control. All right, so first and foremost, the #1 most common issue that we see in ponds in this area is going to be your filamentous algae, pond moss, pond scum. You hear all kinds of different names for it, but it's an algae growth. Most common this early in the year is going to be your Spirogyra species. It'll form this very dense mats over the surface there. Always going to start on the bottom first, and then as it gains momentum, a little bit of sunlight, a little bit of warm water, it's going to buoy up to the surface there, and that's when you're going to get the mats up there. Again, very common. Pretty much every pond is going to deal with this at some point in its lifetime, and I would say the majority of ponds are going to see it year after year. You'll see it immediately as soon as that ice melts away. A lot of times, even this year, because we had a fairly warm winter there for a little bit, you can even see it growing throughout the winter or even underneath the ice for the most part. There's lots of different species that are kind of encompassed in that filamentous algae spectrum, but for the most part, they're all fairly similar as far as treatments and the reasons that it causes. And it always comes down to sunlight penetration for the most part. Again, it starts on the bottom, so the sunlight, as it hits it, it's going to be in your more shallow areas. So, as the sunlight hits it in those shallow areas, it's going to gain that momentum and buoy up to the surface. And that's where you're going to see it become more of a nuisance for the most part. That's where your pond dyes and things like that can come in handy to just block out that sunlight so you don't get as much growth starting on the bottom and kind of break that cycle of that bottom from the top movement from that algae growth. Second algal species we see a lot is Chara or Chara. A lot of people will say it. Chara is usually how we're going to say it for the most part, but it's this bottom growth of algae, but it's very vascular looking. People will confuse it for different weed species, but if you were actually to break it apart, you'll see that it actually has a very hollow structure. It's not technically rooted. There's no roots because it's an algae growth, but it will attach to the bottom or rocky substrates or other weeds sometimes too. But very common. You'll see it in ponds that have generally very hard water. It has a very, very gritty feel if you were to pick it up and pull it apart. And that gritty feel comes from basically pulling in all the minerals from that very, very hard water. And it forms this calcium layer, which makes treatment a little bit more difficult, especially later in the season, as it develops that kind of layer to help protect it. But yeah, muskgrass is a very common name for it. If you were to pull it up and kind of smell it a little bit, it has a little bit of that musky smell, and that's where they get that name of the muskgrass. It's really not, usually doesn't come to a point where you need to really deal with it too much. And actually it has an added benefit of adding water clarity through its filtration process. So unless it really starts to gain momentum and it really is hitting out at the surface there, usually for most customers, I'm telling, okay, let's just let this grow if it's just kind of forming a mat on the bottom for the most part. So yeah, it can really kind of indicate good water quality for the most part, and usually doesn't need to be addressed unless it's extremely, extremely aggressive. Next species we see a lot, especially in this area and especially during the summertime, is going to be these planktonic algae blooms. I have algal in quote there because it's technically not an algae growth. It's actually a type of cyanobacteria, colonial variety, where they form these big colonies of the cyanobacteria that will form these films over the surface. It comes in all kinds of different colors. You'll see the bright greens, you'll see reds, you'll see blues, whites, yellows, oranges. I mean, you know, a lot of times you'll see where it looks like just spilled paint sometimes, and it kind of will blow from side to side as the wind blows it, which makes treatment a little bit easier for it. If you can get where it pulls to one side, you can lay down a copper algicide right on that corner there without having to spray the entire surface. Very, very common in very nutrient-rich ponds. These particular species need a lot of phosphorus for it to grow. So you're not going to see it in your brand new ponds. You're not going to see it in ponds that don't get a lot of runoff or anything like that. It's going to be older ponds with lots of ag runoff, livestock runoff, or just people that fertilize their lawns very, very aggressively. It can have toxic abilities, can get you know, some skin irritation, some stomach issues sometimes. You know, if you hear, you know, recently in the news with the harmful algal blooms, that's generally what they're talking about, these type of planktonic algae species, cyanobacteria species. They're researching it more and more, and the more that they're researching it, the more they're finding how dangerous it can be, not only to humans, but it can lead to dog deaths or sicknesses, livestock deaths. I think just last year, maybe the year before, there was a large die-off of elephants in Africa from a cyanobacteria species. So it's really not something you want to mess with. And if you start to see it in your pond, you want to start, number one, treatments to kill what's on the surface, but also reducing your nutrient load to help kind of cut the source of what's causing it to bloom up. Other type of cyanobacteria species, this blue-green algae will be a little bit more crusted looking, kind of have these really, really thick kind of gelatinous mats over the surface there. So it looks significantly different. Still a cyanobacteria species. Again, there's hundreds and hundreds of these cyanobacteria species, and they all kind of look a little bit different. These can tend to be a little bit more copper resistant, so your traditional copper algicides may not work as well. And the reason for that is it forms these gelatinous surfaces that make it very, very hard to penetrate through and actually make good contact with the cell itself to kill it off. You got to be pretty aggressive with your treatment program, you know, heavy dosages of cyanobactericides. And again, it all comes down to your nutrient levels in the pond. So reducing your phosphorus is key with either beneficial bacterial applications, phosphorus reducers, things like that, to really attack the source instead of just treating the symptom of the issue. We'll get into treatment a little bit down the line, a little bit more generally, but you know, for the most part, that treating the source is going to be the biggest thing for your long-term control of this particular issue. Same as in the previous slide, linked to human illnesses, animal illnesses, they can release toxins, all that sort of stuff. So again, not really something, if you see it in your pond, you want to be swimming or even really breathing it. Sometimes can cause respiratory issues if you have a lot of allergy issues. They're even researching things that can cause neurological damage. So again, it's really not something you really want to mess with. And as soon as you start to see it in your pond, you want to take the steps to start to mitigate those issues. So those are the bulk of the algal species, cyanobacteria species. Now we'll go into some kind of common weed species that we see a lot in the field. So this one here, your narrow leaf pondweed or small leaf pondweed, native species, very, very common. I'm seeing it all over the place right now. It's a very, very early season species that you'll see. You know, grows pretty deep water. You're going to see this in pretty clear water as well, because it likes that very clear water where it can grow out into those deeper areas there. You know, usually, again, not going to get to nuisance levels for the most part. You might see a few patches here and there, but usually is not going to top out unless you have, you know, a very long-standing weed issue that's been just building up that seed base year after year after year, where it forms these very, very large colonies where it's going to be topped out at the surface, making fishing an issue and things like that. But it'll have these long ribbon-like leaves there, and any of the pondweed species where it ends with pondweed, whether it's curly leaf pondweed, narrow leaf pondweed, small leaf pondweed, it's going to have that alternating structure. So if you see it on that picture on the right there, you can see the leaves go from side to side on that stem there. They're not on opposite sides. So that alternating is going to be a very good indication of whether it's a pondweed species or not. So that's always something really, really good to look for when you're trying to figure out what species you're dealing with. Another pondweed species here, again, very, very common, is going to be American pondweed. Very identifiable. You're not usually going to confuse this with another species. Has that very distinguished oval floating leaf on the surface. But this is all rooted, starts on the bottom, and then it'll throw a stem up, and then eventually as that hits the surface, it'll throw out this, this oval leaf that'll float on the surface there. Very, very few leaves are going to be up off the bottom. It's all going to be mostly on the surface. This time of year, you'll start to actually see the leaves starting on the bottom, but as soon as it hits the surface there, it's just floating there. It'll throw up these little seed pods called nutlets sometime in June usually, and that's going to be producing the seeds for its reproduction basically. So if you're doing treatments, you want to jump on that early before it throws up those fruits, or else you're going to see more of it return year after year. So if you're using a systemic herbicide where you're killing through the roots, you want to make sure you jump on that early before it goes to seed, to hopefully kind of nip it in the bud before it gets out of control. Chemical control usually is going to be your best bet. Grass carp species generally aren't going to eat this because it has this very, very waxy leaf, so they really don't like it very much. And then mechanical removal will cause issues, you know, if you're trying to rake it out and things like that, where the plant will break loose and it can cause spreading issues other places. So usually if you got a really bad crop of this, chemical control is going to be your best bet. Again, it's good fish habitat actually. So in small amounts, usually I tell customers to leave it if it's not causing you too many issues. But once it gets to be really, really aggressive and it can spread pretty quickly, you want to do chemical control to keep that under control. Next one, naiad species. There's a few different ones that we deal with around here. So brittle naiad and southern naiad are the two biggest ones that I see. They'll form these big, big clumps up off the bottom. Sometimes it'll look like big evergreen forests and big bushy clumps for the most part, especially your brittle naiad species, which is pictured there. You know, that's a very, very extreme close-up, but it'll form these very, very large mounds up off the bottom. Usually doesn't hit the surface for the most part, but it can get pretty aggressive, and usually chemical control is going to be one that works pretty well. Grass carp love this species, so you know, grass carp is another good method of control if you want to get away from the chemical usage. The leaves there are going to be opposite on the stem, which is different than the pondweed species, which again, you remember are going to be alternate. So these are opposite. So you have leaf here on the same side of that stem, basically. So again, another really good indicator of what species you're specifically dealing with. Again, to find, you know, chemical control methods or just other control methods that may be the best to control that. So here's one, we're going to get into the non-natives a little bit here. So this is Eurasian water milfoil. This is a very, very tough species. Number one for control. Number two, because it spreads like crazy. It'll directly outcompete native species. So like your pondweed species, your naiad species, it'll just create this complete monoculture where it's going to dominate everything else. And that's all you're going to see grow. So it's something as soon as you start to see it, you want to jump on it immediately. Its stem is going to have this kind of reddish color, and then the leaves are very, very fan shaped. It's actually a very, very beautiful plant. And that's why you see that bottom note there that it was introduced in the US by the aquarium industry because it's so pretty. But the problem is people were done with their, aquarium tanks, and then they would dump all their weeds into the pond down the street or in, some creek system. And then now we have the issue where we have this aggressive invasive species taking over a lot of ponds in this area and throughout the US. It's very, very little value to wildlife. Really ducks and things like that are not going to eat this species. Not really good habitat because it's so dense. It can actually crowd, species out where, bass especially aren't going to be able to find food in that very, very dense mat of the weeds there. And then it also is huge for bigger lakes, especially boating lakes. Get clogged up in your motors, cause a lot of issues with that sort of thing. The biggest issue with it is it spreads through fragmentation. So if you were to take a piece of this and you were to pull it apart into two pieces, well, now those two pieces are going to continue to grow into two separate pieces. And then, that's where mechanical removal, if you're getting rakes and things like that, trying to chop it up, that's only going to make that issue worse by spreading out more of those weeds throughout. And every tiny little piece is going to make a brand new piece. So that's where grass carp and mechanical removal are not going to be your best bet. If it comes down to where you get a milfoil issue, really chemical control, again, is going to be about the only solution to get rid of it. A couple different methods, depending on the aggressiveness of the growth in your particular body of water. But for the most part, chemical control is going to be your best bet. Not super common around here. I see it, from time to time. It's becoming more and more prevalent, but it's generally not something that you should expect to see in your pond at any time. But you always want to keep an eye out for it for the most part. This one, on the other hand, is very, very common, duckweed. I'm sure anybody driving through rural counties, rural areas are going to see ponds that are just completely covered in green. Looks like a putting green. You can't even tell there's water there. And generally, that's going to be a duckweed issue. It'll form giant mats over the surface and it'll just completely cover the pond. But actually, it's a very, very tiny, small little plant. This is a very, very close up. It looks like a little tiny clover plant. You can see the thread-like root there at that bottom picture there. Usually have 1 to 3 leaves around kind of a central root system there. Again, this is one that you see in very, very nutrient-rich ponds. So if you were to take a clump of this and put it in a brand new pond, it's not going to do anything. It needs very, very high phosphorus levels. So you're going to see this in ponds with a lot of ag runoff, that really shoots up that phosphorus level. Also just old ponds without aeration, ponds with a lot of trees and leaf debris around it. That's going to be a telltale sign of duckweed issues. Chemical treatment, again, going to be your best bet. Grass carp really can't keep up with it very well because it replicates so fast. So usually chemical control is going to be your best bet. Tilapia is another one. Blue tilapia, which I'm going to touch on a little bit later, is another good control method because they eat pretty aggressively. So they're a species that can keep up with it actually pretty well. But again, if it's to the point where it's covering your whole pond late in the season, chemical control is about your only option at that point. Watermeal, very, very similar to duckweed. Usually we'll actually see them in ponds together, growing together, but it's significantly smaller. I mean, it looks like bright green cornmeal, basically, and it has that really gritty texture.
I can't hear anybody.
But it's very, very small, significantly smaller than the duckweed there. Again, it's going to cover the pond. You'll see it where, just basically a green mat over the surface there, very often confused with algae growth. But if you were to actually pick up those pieces and you see those individual kind of seed-like things, that's the telltale sign that you're dealing with watermeal. Again, very nutrient-rich ponds, older ponds, ag runoff ponds, going to be the most common ponds that deal with these particular issues. Watermeal and duckweed, very, very similar treatment process for the most part. Again, it's going to be chemical control that you're going to be leaning on for the most part. Lilies here, I kind of go back and forth with lilies as far as, you know, the detriment to a pond. They're often planted for aesthetics, obviously beautiful. They have this really nice flower on there, or people will plant them for really good fish habitat. You'll get dragonflies, all that sort of good stuff that you're looking for a very, very natural pond. They're really good nutrient filters too. So there are some positive aspects to having lilies in your pond. But they spread pretty aggressively. So if you have a lot of shallow shelves in your pond, that can be problematic, where if you put literally just one plant in a shallow corner, in a year or two, they can completely wrap around the edge of the pond, and they can grow in pretty deep water. I mean, I've seen them grow 6-8 feet of water if the water is really, really clear. So again, that can be problematic, where they can completely wrap around your pond and just leave you no open water for, you know, fishing or recreational activities. Also, when you buy these lilies, they have a very high risk for contaminants, duckweed being one of them. You know, people will, you know, purchase these from nurseries, or, I mean, we sell them too, but you want to really make sure that you don't have any duckweed or anything like that mixed into that pot. So give them a really good rinse before you actually plant them in your pond, or else you're going to have a whole separate issue on top of that, aside from the lilies just spreading. So yeah, again, there's positive and negatives to the lilies. I'm kind of on the fence with it. Just depends on your particular pond, what you're using the pond for, that sort of thing, of whether you'll have a benefit or a negative return on that one.
Very tight.
Now, one that's very similar to lilies and very confused for lilies from time to time is going to be water shield. Looks like lilies from the surface, you know, but it has a little bit more of an oval leaf on the surface there. And it's a little bit smaller too. So, but if you were to flip it over, you'll kind of see that reddish layer on the bottom there. Yeah, we got a couple people. I'm going to mute a few people here. Sorry. Have that kind of purple reddish undercolor on the leaf, which is a telltale sign of it being water shield versus a lily. It has this really super mucusy layer on the bottom of it, which unfortunately makes it distasteful to grass carp and things like that. So this one spreads very, very aggressively, more of an invasive species. So if you do have this one, it's one that you want to knock out pretty quick before it becomes a really bad nuisance plant for you. So compared to the lilies, this is one, if you see this in your pond, this is not one you want to leave for the most part. You want to go ahead and attack this as soon as you see it, basically. All right, another divisive species here is going to be cattails. Time after time again, I'm called out to people's ponds wanting to address their cattail issues. It's another one that has positive benefits, but also can be problematic. Same benefits as the lilies: wildlife habitat, nutrient filtration, you know, red-winged blackbird habitats, you know, all that sort of really positive natural things. But these things spread like crazy. You know, if you can see in that picture there, the catkin there, that's holding all those seeds. And, you know, later in the season, it'll go from that brown color to the sprouted kind of white puffy stuff, similar to like a dandelion. And then it's just going to spread all over that pond. So they can be pretty aggressive. A lot of times I'll tell customers, let's keep them contained in certain areas, especially at inflow points, to help with filtration. But if they start to spread in areas where you're fishing or, you know, doing a lot of recreational activities, you usually want to keep those under control. They're very easy to kill. Actually, with chemical control, you're going to use a systemic herbicide that's going to kill through the root system. Mechanical removal works too, you know, if you want to cut them down right at the water's level. But that's a little bit more frustrating because they just keep on coming back. So usually chemical control is going to be your best bet to kill through that root. But yeah, I mean, cattails, most people don't want them. I tend to lean towards leaving a little bit in a few select areas, but keeping control, you know, around certain areas that you're going to be fishing and things like that. So positive and negatives to the cattails, but you do want to keep an eye on them and make sure they're not going to take over your whole pond. So those are some of the most popular species that I see, the most common species that I get calls for. You know, the biggest thing for figuring out what you need to do with a particular species that you're dealing with is identification. That's going to tell you, okay, which avenues are available to you for treatments. Do I even need to treat this particular species, and kind of timing, all that sort of stuff. Chemical control is going to be probably the most common method that people will come to us for, either for us to do the treatments for you, or buying the products from us to do treatments yourself, which pretty much every product that we use out in the field is available to you. So there's nothing that's restricted use that you need a license for, as long as you're doing it on your own private land. So all that sort of stuff is available if you're looking to chemical control certain species. There are water use restrictions on some of the products. So copper algicides, whether it's cutrine, Captain, things like that, copper sulfate, aren't going to have any water use restrictions. So you can swim, you can fish, you can irrigate right after treatments. It's going to be the herbicides that you're going to have more issues with. So they can have irrigation restrictions as low as a day and as high as a 30-day restriction for certain products. But there's also ones that have swimming restrictions, drinking water restrictions, things like that. So those are things where you're going to have to read the label or come to us with particular questions you have on when to use it and that sort of thing. Timing is also very, very important with chemical control. Applying it before you see any of the algae is kind of getting a jump start. I hear that all the time. Can I put something in now to prevent it from coming on? For the most part, no. There's a couple pre-emergence, but for the most part, you got to see this stuff and make really, really good contact with it to actually get effective control. Algae especially, and then weed species as well. You want to make sure to make an application on top of those weed beds so it can sink down on top of it to get really good effective control. So chemical control, again, the biggest thing, identification, figuring out exactly what you need are the most important things, and application rates, all that sort of stuff. So that's where relying on, places like us, extension offices, things like that, they can point you in the right direction on what exactly you need to do. Biological control, very, very popular option. Grass carp being the biggest one. Pretty much every pond stocking that we do is going to include grass carp in there. Really good, kind of helps control a lot of these issues before they become a really bad nuisance. But you have to kind of keep in mind their limitations. So number one, they're very, very picky on what they like to eat. And the other limitation is you really only get maybe 5 to 8 years of really good control before they get fat and lazy and they really don't want to eat too much for you. So you're replacing those on a fairly regular basis to make sure that they keep up with those issues. Tilapia are another good option. We started stocking those a handful of years ago, strictly for vegetation control. They're very, very aggressive eaters, strictly vegetarian. They eat everything green, whereas grass carp are a little bit more picky. Tilapia will eat pretty much everything. And I'm going to touch on these species a little bit more in depth when I get to the game fish stocking, but those are really two good options if you're looking to get away from chemical control and something a little bit more natural. There are regulations on both of those fish. Tilapia especially. In Indiana, there's no restrictions. In Ohio, there's no restrictions, but in Kentucky, you have to go through a permitting process to actually allow the state to stock them. And in further south areas, they won't let you stock them because they're afraid they could potentially survive the winters. Again, I'm going to touch on this later with more specifics on that. More specifically for your area in Dearborn County and really the state of Indiana in general is on the grass carp. You can stock them, but you have to have a company that is certified to stock them actually put them in their pond. So this is not something that you can come pick up at our farm and stock them yourself. We actually have to physically put them in the pond for you because we hold the permit to do that basically. Grass carp are hardy to this area, tilapia are not. Tilapia are ones that will die in the wintertime. They're a tropical fish, so you gotta until that water temperature hits about 68 degrees or so before they start dying off. So that's something you have to restock every year if you're looking to keep up with that control. And then also the biggest thing with biological control is realistic expectations. I mean, they're not going to keep everything in check. They can do a lot of things. There are things that are really nice to have in your tool bag, but don't expect complete control by just stocking a few grass carp. And that's going to completely get rid of your algae or weed species. And then last for control is going to be mechanical control. So this is, taking your own labor, rakes, cutters, things like that, and physically removing them from the pond. There are positives to this. You're removing all that organic material, whereas if you're doing chemical control, you're killing that weed species. It's dying, it's sinking to the bottom, and it's contributing to accumulating phosphorus levels, muck accumulation, that sort of stuff. So there are benefits to it of actually getting out there and physically removing it. We sell a whole line of different types depending on what species you're trying to remove, whether it's something you're throwing to the bottom and actually physically cutting, or something with a blade that you can actually ride on the surface and cut cattails and things like that. So there are quite a few different options. Really good for small little areas, especially if you have a dock area to remove small areas. But if you have a very aggressive weed that's spreading throughout your whole water column, I mean, mechanical removal is going to take you a lot of time, and usually you get very short-term results for the most part, because you're not getting all the way through the root. You're just cutting it, and then it's going to grow right back right immediately. Inexpensive, chemical control can be expensive. So this is a nice cheap method to kind of jump on the removal early before it really starts to develop. My biggest thing with the mechanical control is that fragmentation issue. If you don't remove every piece of that plant, you leave a couple little pieces floating. Certain species like the milfoil, coontail, things like that are just going to continue to spread. And they're going to cause you more issues later on down the line. So that's something to really look for when you're thinking about mechanical control for the most part. All right, so that's the end with the algae and weed identification there. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of power through the few slides, and then we can do questions at the end. That way I can get through everything for you guys pretty quickly in case people have specific questions about things. All right, we're going to move on to game fish stocking here. So I'm going to kind of go over, touch on very popular species, stocking rates, what's good about them, what's bad about them, all that sort of stuff. Here's a picture of our farm down in Newtown, which is on the east side of Cincinnati. From Dearborn County, you're maybe 40 minutes, 50 minutes away. It's a really, really cool place. So I encourage you, if you haven't been to our farm, to stop on by. You can pick up fish there while you're there. We sell plants, all our products are available for sale there as well. So, if you're bored on a Saturday afternoon and want to come on by and check out the place, it's always a good place to stop on by, ask all our biologist questions, that sort of thing. I will direct you to that Find Pond Size website there, findpondsize.com. Really, really good tool to help determine the size of your pond, which is always a good step for not only chemical control, but stocking rates, fountain and aeration sizing, all that sort of stuff. So I would write that one down, visit that. Basically, it pulls up your address through Google Maps. You put a couple pins around the margins of your pond, and it calculates up the surface acreage of your pond. So really, really good tool to help figure out next steps for stocking and really everything related to a pond. When coming out with stocking, I encourage people to look at multiple different ways of information. So talking with fish farmers like us, DNR, Soil and Water, obviously, who's putting on, great events like this to get information out to people, books, internet, talking to your neighbors who have ponds that may have a experience that you might not have. The one you want to be careful with is obviously internet research. That can kind of lead you down the wrong path. A lot of information can be very, very location specific. So if you're looking at an article for stocking a pond in Texas, that's going to be significantly different than stocking a pond in, central Indiana, just on species that are available, growth rates, all that sort of stuff. So that's the one thing you kind of want to be careful with. But, the more information you can gather, the more information you'll kind of get to point you in the right direction, at least. My first question when I'm meeting with people on site or over the phone when they're trying to get a stocking plan together is, what are your goals for the pond? Are you wanting to fish the pond? Are you going to want to swim the pond? What particular species are you looking to have in there? Are you looking to eat fish out of the pond? All those sort of stuff. So those are the things you want to identify to help determine where you want to go next with your stocking plan. But you got your predator fish, your forage fish, which are very important to help feed everything, and then your herbivores. So I'm going to kind of break this down, starting with your predators, and then working on my way down to the forage fish, and then ending with the more of those algae eaters, tilapia, grass carp, that sort of stuff. First and foremost is going to be your largemouth bass. So by far the most popular fish to stock in a pond for, your sport fish, basically. They're your apex predator in your pond. They're eating a lot of fish in there. So you want to make sure that they have plenty of food, minnows, shiners, large bluegill population to feed them. Identification basically is going to be that dark green band right down the center of them. Kind of can be broken up into those little kind of stripes like that, kind of from the head all the way down to the tail. They spawn, mid-March to mid-June when that water temperature hits about 62. They're pretty long-lived. They can live, 16 plus years sometimes, depending on lots of different factors there. They can be cannibalistic, so they will eat their own young if they don't have a readily available food source. So again, that's where, making sure you have plenty of bluegill, lots of minnows, lots of shiners, that sort of thing will be very, very important. And they can tend to overpopulate a pond very, very quickly. And what will happen is they'll stunt themselves. So if you hear someone say, oh, I have a stunted bass population, that's because there's too many bass, not enough food to go around. So usually that has to do with harvesting. So usually you're harvesting in an acre pond, usually 25 to 35 fish per year. And that's going to be in that 10 to 14 inch range. You don't want to pull out the small ones. You don't want to pull out your really big trophy bass, but those mid-sized fish will be important to harvest to keep their numbers down. Hybrid striped bass, also very, very popular. They're aggressive sport fish, but they are sterile. So whatever you stock in there, you're going to have to reproduce. They're sterile through that hybridization process of the two species. They have that really, really nice silver color with those broken stripes along the sides there. They grow very, very fast. They're very aggressive. They take to the pellet food really well, so you can get the growth rates up very, very quickly. So you can have a really nice fish at the end of the season. Really great to eat, really good fish to have in there if you want to harvest your fish for table fare. They tend to be open water fish, so they're not going to directly compete with your largemouth. They're going to be out in that open water, kind of hitting on, shiner species. So that's why you want to make sure you have plenty of shiners in there to feed them. Stocking rates are about 50 fish per acre for an initial stocking. Channel catfish. This is about the only catfish that we recommend stocking in a pond situation is going to be the channels. I would not stock, bullheads, blues, all that shovelheads, that sort of things. They'll get way too big, and they're going to put too high of a demand on your forage fish. It will directly compete with your bass species. They have that really deep forked tail there. Again, another fish that's very, very good to eat. So if you want, a food source in your pond, the channel catfish are a really good thing. Reproduction can be tough. Usually they're not going to reproduce in a pond. They need a very specific structure and habitat. They like to back their bodies into cavities. So sometimes they'll dig out the banks, or if you put buckets and things like that in the pond, they'll use those. I would advise you not to allow them to spawn in your pond. So don't put those structures like field tiles and tubing and that sort of stuff, because if they start reproducing in there, they can really dominate the pond, and you can have a really big issue on your pond. Negative effects of, turbidity, and then really just eating up all the other fish in the pond for the most part. 50 fish per acre is usually your stocking rate initially for these guys. Rainbow trout, another top tier predator. This one's very specific. They don't survive the summers here. The water is too warm in this area, but they're a fun one to put in, fall, and basically you would fish them fall through the winter, early spring, and fish them all out. Really great table fare, all that sort of stuff. So very specific pond. They're not going to survive the summers unless you have very, very aggressive spring influence in the pond. And I'm not talking a spring, just trickling in there. I'm talking a huge spring that's going to keep your water temperatures below basically 70 degrees. But we stock them when they're, a pound, 2 pounds. So they're basically ready to catch as soon as you put them in. Usually stocking about 100 pounds per acre for the most part. Black crappie, very, very common. you know, to stock in this area. I usually tell people precautions on these because they do reproduce pretty aggressively, to not stock them in ponds that are under 2 acres because they are so aggressive, unless you really like to harvest crappie, you like to eat crappie, and you're going to be very aggressive with keeping up with them, because they can really quickly overpopulate and cause a lot of issues with competing with your bass and things like that. They tend to prefer really deep, clear lakes. They need a lot of vertical structure. So if you're looking to get them to spawn, you know, down trees, stacked pallets, that sort of thing are going to be really good to keep them spawning effectively. 100 fish per acre, usually the stocking rate for that species. Now we're going to get into your forage fish a little bit more. So bluegill, sunfish being your most common species. They're going to be your reproducer. So they're reproducing multiple times per year. So their spawn are going to be feeding your bass species and your other predator species in the pond. They're going to be spawning May through the summer, and they usually start right around 65 to 68 degrees. And they're going to form these big nests. If you see there on the bottom right, that's a telltale sign of bluegill spawning in your pond, where you see these like divots around the shallow areas of the ponds. Stocking rates 300 to 400 per acre. Identifiable by having those dark bodies on the bottom for the most part, mostly solid dark blue and gray fins, which will kind of be in comparison to the other sunfish species. Mostly insectivores, but they will eat small minnows and other small fish as well. Good for mosquito control and things like that too. Red-eared sunfish, also known as the shell cracker. These are mollusk eaters, so they're going to eat snails, you know, all those sort of things that, you know, are going to have those shells around them, because they have these little teeth actually that can break open those shells, and they can get inside to the actual mollusk inside of there. Really good for parasite control if you have issues with grub species and things like that. And the reason that we stock them for the most part is going to be in swimming ponds. So, you know, if someone is going to be doing a lot of swimming, they have a lot of kids swimming, usually you're going to want to leave out your bluegill and your hybrid bluegill species and replace them with these red ear, because they're not as aggressive. Some bluegill species can come up and nip at you a little bit, but these species are going to be pretty timid and they really stay away, which unfortunately makes them a little bit more difficult to catch. So if you're really looking for a really good sport fish, they might not be your best thing. But yeah, they're kind of that good compromise if you're looking to do some swimming and fishing at the same time. About 200 fish per acre, but they do reproduce, so they're going to be a good forage fish for your bass species as well. So here's your hybrid bluegill. So this is your big sport fish as far as sunfish go, cross between the straight bluegill sunfish and the green sunfish. You know, they get very big. They can easily reach a pound within a year if you're really pumping a lot of food there. They have that larger mouth than a bluegill, so they can take on a lot more food a lot more quickly. So that's why you see their growth rates explode a lot faster. Identification is going to be that more yellow color on those bottom fins there, and around that anal fin. It will be the most common, that really, really bright yellow color. So help you identify between the straight bluegill and the hybrid bluegill. When they hybridize them, they're mostly male for the most part, so you're not going to get a ton of reproduction. Even though they will reproduce, you're not going to get a lot of offspring from these. So you do want to have these plus a regular sunfish species as well if you're looking to feed bass and things like that. This should not be stocked in your pond as your exclusive sunfish and forage species. Fatted minnows, so these are always going to be stocked in every stocking package to help keep the pressure off the bluegill, feed your bass, feed your crappie, catfish, all that sort of stuff. They reproduce multiple times throughout a season. So if you get them to survive and they're reproducing on their own, they're a really good forage fish to have in there. Most common bait sold in the US. Really good for mosquito control, insect larvae, that sort of thing. And usually you're doing about 40 pounds per acre on that particular species. Very similar golden shiners. These are different from the minnows, different species, and they get much larger. They can get 8-10 inches sometimes. So they're going to be feeding your bigger bass. So if you're looking to get big trophy bass in your pond, you know, 3, 4, 5 pound bass, you want to make sure you have lots of shiners. Much more efficient meal than the minnows, just because they're so much larger. You know, 25 pounds per acre is usually what you're stocking with those. They're going to be in that more open water. So if you got a lot of hybrid striped bass, these are another good option as well. Also reproduce just as frequent as the minnows. So another one that, you know, if you get them where they're established and they're reproducing, very, very good food source. So the grass carp, I touched on this a little bit earlier. You know, the triploid white amur is their full name, native to China, but don't confuse them with the Asian carp that you hear, you know, in the news that you see, you know, jumping in the rivers and all that sort of stuff. They are an Asian carp, but they are not the same species as those. These can only be sold sterilized. So every fish that you buy from us or another fish farm has to be certified sterile. Multiple steps that we have to go through and hoops we have to jump through to get these certified in order to sell. But yeah, basically they're not going to reproduce. So you're going to put them in there. You're going to get 5 to 8 years of good control, and then you're going to restock them occasionally to keep their numbers up. They can live a long time though, 20 plus years sometimes, and they turn into these huge submarines. I mean, they can easily get 30 plus pounds throughout their lifetime. So they get pretty large. 8 to 12 fish per acre is generally stocking rates, depending on what species you're dealing with, how aggressive that growth is, that sort of thing. We include this in every stocking package, even a new stocking package, to just kind of keep those issues with the weeds and algae growth down throughout the season. The alternative to the grass carp, or maybe in addition to the grass carp, would be the blue tilapia. It's a tropical fish based out of Africa and the Middle East. So the biggest thing there being the tropical fish, they're not going to survive the winters here. You got about 50-ish degrees before they really start dying off aggressively. So that puts us early October for the most part. They are a restricted species. So again, I touched on you needing a permit in Kentucky. Indiana residents, you don't have to go through that process. So you can get those pretty readily available. But the biggest thing is they're going to die off for you at the winter. So either try to get them all fished out by the end of the season, or you may have some floating fish towards the end of the year. They pretty much eat everything green. So they're a really good control method for algae growth, weed growth, that sort of thing. And also they're really good to eat. So, I mean, they're great to stock in there. And at the end of the season, if you can catch a bunch of these, use them in fish tacos, that sort of thing. They're really good to do that sort of thing. Yeah, and the last note for the farm, if you're looking to stock your pond, that sort of thing, swing on by, or you can go online, call our office. There are multiple ways to order there. All right, we got one more. I'm trying to get through it really quick so we can hopefully have some time for some questions. And we're going to do aeration here. Okay. All right, so this one's a little bit quicker. I'm just going to kind of touch on the different options with pond aeration. Usually going to be divided into two sections, which will be surface aeration versus your subsurface or bottom-based aeration systems. So your surface aerators versus your subsurface, kind of the defining characteristics are going to be, surface aerators are going to be your fountains, a little bit more decorative units. So there's a couple categories within those surface aerators, and there's also just plain surface aerators, which will be those high oxygen transfer units, which just agitate the surface aggressively without that necessarily showy pattern. And there's going to be your subsurface aeration, which comes in multiple avenues: your electric, your windmill, and your solar options. So first of all, your surface units, first one will be your fountains, which will be very, very decorative. Obviously, people are going to stock these in, backyard ponds, HOA ponds, that sort of thing, where they're looking for something that's showy, striking, is going to look nice in the backyard, that sort of thing. They come in many sizes, different horsepowers, different patterns. I mean, our catalog has basically half of the catalog is just all different fountain options with different patterns, manufacturers, all that sort of stuff. The thing to keep in mind with the fountains, they're very high pressure but low volume. So that means as far as aeration goes, they're not going to be your best bet. They're mostly for decoration. You're not going to get a ton of oxygen creation from that agitation on the surface, as if you would with a surface aerator or a bottom-based aeration system. Other thing to keep in mind, they're not resistant to wind. So like that one pictured there, if you get a good wind, that's throwing that water all over the place if it's really, really windy. Some of the nicer units have wind controls where it's going to drop that level if it gets really windy, but for the most part, that's something you really want to consider. So the compromise with fountains versus aeration is going to be these V-shaped decorative aerators, they call them. Really, really good compromise if you have someone that wants a little bit of a pattern, but still wants a good amount of aeration as well. So moves a lot of water, so not going to throw it up as high, but you're still going to get a decent agitation on the surface there. Most of them, the highest you're going to get for the most part is going to be about 8 feet high and maybe 30, 40 feet wide for the most part, depending on the horsepower. So it's not super showy, but you're still going to get a lot of water movement, and it's a good balance between something that's decorative and then something that's going to move enough water to create enough oxygen in the pond for fish health, you know, all that sort of stuff. On both the fountains and this V-shaped aerator here, you can put LED lights on, all that sort of stuff, so they light up, look really pretty during the evening hours. So. And then last surface aeration is going to be these high oxygen transfer units, which is probably by far my favorite aeration unit that we sell and we see out in the field a lot. Super high volume. So it's basically a floating motor that has a propeller on it that just churns up a bunch of water on the surface. Not particularly decorative, although I don't really mind how it looks. I mean, you can even put LED lights on these, so it has a really cool glowing orb effect in the night. But they're used mostly commercially a lot. I mean, we have one of these in pretty much every single one of our production ponds to keep that oxygen very, very high because our ponds are very highly stocked with fish. So we need high oxygen levels to keep them healthy. Significantly lower cost than a fountain. They're about half the cost of any given fountain, depending on horsepower. And then we use these if a customer calls us that says, hey, I'm having a fish kill event. I got fish up at the surface gasping for air. We're going to run out one of these units to stop that fish kill pretty much immediately. The other added benefit is it helps break up those surface films and algae growth. If you see in the picture there, see all that disturbance it's producing. So if you get issues with like the planktonic algae and the cyanobacteria, those filmy things on the surface in the summertime, this is a really good option to kind of mechanically break that stuff up with that particular system. All right, now we're going to get into the bottom-based subsurface diffused aeration. Diffused aeration comes from the name, if you can see, kind of it diffuses all these little tiny bubbles all the way from the bottom of the pond to the top of the pond. So basically you have a shore-based either piston or rotary vane compressor outside of the water, and then you have air line that's running down to this diffuser station that you see in the picture there with these silica stones. And those stones, as the air pushes through it, is going to produce these very, very fine little bubbles. And the fine bubbles are the most important thing. If you were to just have a very big open bubble without those diffused stones, it's really not going to provide you any benefit for the most part. Those small bubbles can just hold so much more surface area, and it's going to push way more of that water and that oxygen up to the surface of the pond. It creates that upwelling effect as you see in the picture there. And then as long as it's properly sized for your surface acreage and your depth, the depth is probably the most important thing. You can get full aeration throughout your entire water column with, 1, 2, up to 5, 6, 7. I mean, there's multiple different ways. And again, that comes down to knowing your surface acreage, knowing your depth throughout the whole water body, which is important to figure out, okay, sizing for these units. The biggest thing to keep in mind with these is generally you don't want to put these in a pond that's older than, say, 10 years old. They're really good for brand new ponds, to get that established early. The problem with putting these in older ponds is since they sit on the bottom there, if you've had years of muck accumulation, it's going to pump up all that muck up off the bottom, releasing all those locked away nutrients, and you could potentially have more issues with planktonic algae growth because it's released all that phosphorus and it's more readily available up at the surface. If you do lean more towards these units in an older pond, I usually recommend people to use beneficial bacteria at the same time to help eat up that release of that phosphorus and that muck that it's releasing up off the bottom. So that is one thing to kind of keep in mind with these units. So they come in multiple different ways. So this will be our electric unit. We call them complete pond aeration systems, or CPAs. Super energy efficient. A single compressor pulls about 3 amps on a 120 volt system. Very discreet, comes in that little insulated cabinet there that you just mount on a post. These plug straight into a regular GFCI outlet. Pretty cheap. You can get a single diffuser system for in the $1,400 range with everything that you need. And basically you're going to plug these things in and run them 365, 24/7. You know, they have that benefit of the winter time to basically leave a hole open in the ice to allow gas exchange, which is very, very important. You can have winter kills if you have a solid sheet of ice and a lot of snow on the surface, because you can't have that gas exchange. You don't have sunlight penetrating through. So this helps solve a lot of those issues. Maintenance is pretty easy. Basically, it's just maintenance to that compressor. So every 3 years, you want to do a maintenance change on it. Basically taking apart, kind of putting some new seals and, things like that. It does have a filter on there as well. You want to kind of check and keep clean as much as possible. So maintenance pretty low, cost is pretty low, extremely efficient. As far as efficiency goes, by far the most efficient aeration, but few caveats with, age, muck accumulation, that sort of thing to keep in mind. So diffused aeration you can also get through with a windmill system. They're really cool. I mean, they look really nice sitting next to the pond in the field, that sort of thing kind of brings up a sense of nostalgia for days of past. Semi-dependable. I put semi there because there are issues, with those pumps. They're not extremely efficient. The biggest thing to think of is you need to have constant wind for these to be a really viable option for you. At least 5 miles per hour of wind year round being key. So summertime, if you tend to have stagnancy issues where you're not having a lot of wind in the summertime, that's when you need aeration the most. So that can be kind of a limiting factor on that. Lots of assembly with these things. I mean, we don't even install these because they're too much of a pain in the butt to install. So if you buy one of these from us, you're kind of on your own of assembling these. So Indiana, a lot of windmills out there, a lot of wind. So, for your area, if you have a lot of wind and electric is not available to you, this is a pretty good option, if you're looking to get aeration in your pond. And last but not least is going to be solar aeration, which is fairly new to the market of taking care of ponds and that sort of thing. They're not quite up to where I would like them to be yet. Most of the cheaper units do not have a battery backup, so they're only running when the sun's out. So, a nice cloudy, overcast day, that thing might not be running, or at least running as efficiently. So that's something you want to keep in mind. There are ones with battery backup, but those are crazy expensive, where it's actually going to store that energy that it's, built up over a nice sunny day. Lots of routine maintenance. You got to make sure those panels are nice and clean. If they get even a little bit of dirt on there, that system is not going to be as efficient. And there's also limitations with depth. If you have a pond that's over 12 feet in depth in the deepest area, it's not going to be able to pump that efficiently in that deep of water. So there's going to be more shallow applications, and you got to make sure you have a very, very sunny spot for the most part. They're getting better and better every year. So I would, this is going to be a better option as we move forward, as they develop these things. They're going to become cheaper, more efficient, that sort of thing. So I would look forward to this sometime in the future. But as for now, there are limitations. But again, if this is your only option, you don't have any wind, you're nowhere close to any electric source, you're out in the middle of a field, and this is your only option, it's a decent one, but there are some limitations with that. And I think that's it. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to let me know. We got a couple more minutes before the next presenter.
Alex, I really appreciate that. That was really comprehensive, about as much as you can probably get within an hour.
I was trying to get through it really fast, but yeah.
No, you were very clear. We've got about 10, 15 people watching. And this will also be on our YouTube channel. I'm really excited about that, but I want to give everyone the chance to ask Alex any questions before we turn it over to our next speaker. And if you can't unmute, that's okay. Put it in the chat and we'll ask Alex directly before he calls it a day.
I do have a question.
Go ahead.
An existing pond, if you don't know the population that's in that pond to begin with.
Yeah, so that is tough, especially in smaller ponds. We do offer population surveys where we have electrofishing equipment, if you've seen, where they will, shock lakes and things like that to get a good idea. But in smaller ponds, that's not realistic. Number one, it's expensive. Number two, it might not be your best method. So what I tell most people is to just regularly fish the pond. So go out there on a couple weekends, fish the pond, and literally record what you're catching. So today I went out, I caught 5 bass. They were roughly this size. I caught 20 bluegill. They were roughly this size. And the more data you can get based on that, you can bring that information to us. And then we can say, okay, there seems to be something out of balance. You're catching way too many bass versus bluegill, or these bass are all very, very small. They could be stunted, that sort of thing. So that's usually my recommendation, is to just go out there and fish and make a fishing log. And that sort of information will help at least companies like us kind of give you information on what you need to do, whether it's harvesting or stocking more fish or things like that.
You didn't mention the stocking, the amount to stock the tilapia in the pond.
Oh, tilapia, sure. Our general recommendation is 30 pounds per surface acre for the most part. And again, if you have a very aggressive issue, you might go a little bit higher. Maybe if you don't need as many, or you don't have as many issues, you could do less, but usually 30 pounds per surface acre.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Alex? All right, well, Alex, thank you so much again to you and Jones Fish. You're welcome, obviously, to stay and watch our next presenter, and you've probably met Dave before at some point, or at least heard of him. But thank you again so much, Alex. I really appreciate that in-depth talk.
Yeah, no problem.
If anyone, oh, go on, Alex. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, if anybody has any more questions or anything like that, obviously we're available. Phone numbers were up there, website, that sort of thing. So anything else comes up, just let us know. Alex,
we appreciate it. So yeah, folks, get in touch with Jones Fish if you see fit, and we really appreciate them taking part in this workshop today. With that, we'll move on to our second presenter of the day. We're going to be covering fish filleting, cleaning, and canning. And I'm proud to introduce my colleague in Ripley County for Purdue Extension, and that is Dave Osborne. And I will let Dave take it away here.
So Alex, I'll show you my favorite way to do a fish survey, just because I have them here. I went yesterday and caught fish. If you can see these fish, if you catch a dozen to 20 bluegill and your pond is in good shape, you should see 4 size classes. You should catch a couple of the bigger size class bluegill, like these, then in the middle size class, and then you should be catching some smaller ones. And if you see all those size classes, the fish are thick. They're not sunken in behind the head, and you get all that, going, then you've got a healthy population. Bluegill are one of those fish that everybody calls me, and the first thing they always say is, and I think he's going to pull it back so you can maybe see my head.
Is that come better, Dave?
Oh, I can get in front here for a minute. I'll come around here. So we're looking at, most of the time people call and they say, hey, what do I stock my pond with? Well, once you have fish in a pond, most of the time our pond management comes to habitat, checking the water quality, making sure we have good water quality, and then it's population management. Most people that think they want to stock the pond actually have too many fish in the pond to begin with. I know you said 25 to 35 bass a year. That's a great number. That's what we use. But you're looking at 400 to 500 bluegill a year, and very few people really get to that number. They don't fish their pond hard enough to get that number. And so one of the rules of thumb I like to use is, if you don't fish your pond a lot, don't ever throw a bluegill back. Just keep every bluegill you catch, because you probably will not take enough bluegill. So if you see 3 or 4 age classes, then you know your pond's in pretty good shape. Now in that same pond, the bluegill are really nice, but every crappie that you catch looks like that. They're a cookie cutter sized crappie. If you don't keep those crappie and don't be aggressively harvesting those crappie are going to stay cookie cutter size. They're not going to grow the way they should. So in that pond, we actually had crappie pretty well under control. We took a lot of them through the ice. We haven't ice fished in hardly 3 years. So that pond kind of went to the small size again. So in your panfish, a good rule of thumb that I like to use with people that don't catch enough fish is to don't ever throw a crappie or a bluegill back. And then manage your bass the way Alex said. I think Alex did a good job of covering that. So if you're going to keep all these fish, what are you going to do with them? Well, this fish right here, in my opinion, is the best tasting fish that God put on the earth. You can have your ocean fish, you can have tilapia, you can have shrimp, but bluegill, especially in the spring and during the winter in cold water, is the best tasting fish there is. And I'm gonna go over some basics of how to clean a fish. One of the very first things I'm gonna look at is a fillet knife, just a basic fillet knife. This is a Rapala fillet knife. It's got a flexible blade. This is a Bubba blade, flexible blade fillet knife. And you'll notice the difference is the handle. If you want a handle or you have a little bit of dexterity issues and you need the handle you can hold on to better, these Bubba blades are a little more expensive, but they have extremely good handles. Ergonomically, they fit your hand well. They've got some places to put your thumb and to get some grip to do the flaying and the trimming and things like that. And this is a rubber type material that even as it gets wet, it stays very tactile, and so it will not slip in your hand. I grew up cleaning fish with a Rapala fillet knife. So I'm going to show you how I clean the fish with a regular fillet knife, and then I'm going to talk to you about the electric knife. So what I like to do is come right behind this fin right here, and I like to use an angle towards the stomach here in the top, and I like to make the initial cut in the fish. So basically, I'm making a slit in the fish. I'm going to take the tip of my knife, and I'm going to come about halfway down the fish, just staying right on this backbone here. So what it does is it opens up a little tab. And what I've done is that tip of that knife has found that backbone, so I know I'm right against the backbone. I'll insert the knife. I'll cut through the ribs. I'll take it down to the tail. I'll flip that fillet over, and I'll take the skin off. Now these fish clean a lot easier when they're fresh. I had to catch these fish ahead of time. I'll turn that over, do the same angle on the back side. Clean it down to the tail. I'll keep my knife flat on the table, and I'll cut through that fillet. Now you see what's on my board here, the black? This time of year, why those fish tend to be a little better in colder water is this time of year those fish are feeding on insect larvae in the muck at the bottom of the pond. That black is what you see coming from that mucky feeding that the bluegill do. And since they're feeding in that muck, if you've ever waded in a pond and you smelled what the bottom smells like, that's what that smells like. And that can taint the fish a little bit. Anytime an animal feeds on something like that, it can make the fish have a little bit of that flavor. Bluegill aren't too bad about that. Then I come in with the ribs and I cut through the ribs, and I simply take my knife and I trace around the rib cage. That takes the ribs out, and it leaves me with a boneless fillet of fish. Okay, that's pretty easy to do with a regular fillet knife. But if you're going to clean hundreds of fish, there's an easier method. And here's a couple Here's a couple knives that I have. One is American Angler. It's just an electric fillet knife. You'll notice the blade's the same shape as a fillet knife. When I started cleaning fish with an electric knife, it was the old turkey carving knife that we had in the kitchen. We burned up about 20 motors because the motors weren't designed to fillet 100, 200 fish at a time. But the blades weren't shaped well. The blade on these are shaped very well for that. And then Bubba also makes a rubberized, kind of the same handle as their other knife. They make a knife too. Mr. Twister makes some fillet knives. Several companies, Rapala makes electric fillet knives. The electric fillet knife just makes this whole process easier. And I'll show you on a crappie here. I'll use a crappie. All the fish that you can clean with these knives clean pretty much the same way, even the catfish. So I'm going to start the knife. I'm going to make that first initial slit. I'm going to come down the backbone. A lot of people don't do that, but that actually gives your knife a place to run, and you know you're against the backbone. I turn the knife. I run it to the tail. I keep my knife flat. I take the skin off, and I take the skin. I flip the fish over. I like to turn and make a little cut through the rib cage just so my knife has a place to follow. I turn it way over. And you can see here that there's no meat or anything left on the skin or the fish itself. Again, I'll come back with a regular fillet knife, keep my point straight up and down, and I'll just carve a semicircle right around the rib cage. That leaves us 2 fillets, boneless fillets. Now, when I was a kid and we caught smaller bluegill like this, some of you may remember this technique. You scale it with a spoon, then you cut the head off, then you took and opened up the stomach, got rid of the guts. So you had a scaled fish like that, you fried the whole fish, and you picked all through the bones. How many of you remember that? You know, that's how we cleaned a whole lot of young bluegill. We had scales everywhere, and fish lasted a lot longer because it took you about 5 minutes to pick all the bones and pick the skeleton off. But it was kind of a neat way to clean the fish. This is boneless. You bread that. You fry it in your favorite breading, and you can eat it in a sandwich, and you don't have to pick through the bones. But that's kind of the old technique. I don't like the scale fish. I like the filleting technique. So that's basic panfish cleaning. Are there any questions out there that I can cover or show again? So let's talk a little bit about preserving. So I clean, say I clean 200 bluegill and crappie. I'm going to rinse these off about 2 or 3 times in cool water. I'm going to put them in a Ziploc bag, squeeze all the air out of it, and I'm going to freeze them fresh. I do not want to soak them in salt water for any length of time. If I put them in salt water, I don't really want to freeze those fish. I want to eat those fish fresh. That salt water, anytime we add salt to any of our game meat or things like that, we've actually started a process of changing the structure of that meat. And so I don't like freezing them. My dad used to freeze fish in the old milk cartons with a gallon of water in there, and he froze more water than he did fish. These fish will stay good for about 6 to 8 months. If you're going to store fish longer than that, maybe a vacuum sealing system is the way to go. But I like to clean fish fresh. I like to rinse them off. I like to bag them, and I like to freeze them. And the fresher the fish are, these are, like I said, have been in the refrigerator for about 2 days. They tend to be a little soft when they go a couple of days in refrigeration, but they're still okay. So Panfish, they're ready to eat that way. So let's talk about some other fish. Let's talk about like catfish and suckers and things like that. I grew up fishing trot lines in White River, and we caught suckers all the time. One of the new fish on the scene now in our rivers is Asian carp. This is an Asian carp fillet, okay? And what you'll notice, and the reason I wanted to use this, you see on the back that real dark red meat? If you've ever tasted fish and you taste the fish and you said, ooh, that tastes fishy, you're tasting a lot of this red muscle. And everybody wants to call that the mud vein. This muscle has nothing to do with mud. Okay? What it has to do with is channel catfish, the salmon, the trout, all are in current, or they're swimming the whole time. They never stop swimming. And this muscle, this red muscle, is simply like our heart muscle. It's a muscle that's created to be able to just work the whole time. So when they're there swimming in current and just swimming easy, this red muscle is what's helping them swim and just keep swimming all day long, all night long. And so it's like our heart muscle. It's dark. And that dark muscle has a stronger flavor. So what we do with sucker and Asian carp and things like that is we can it. Here's a pint jar of canned fish. It's real white fish. It keeps well. It's got a shelf life of a couple of years when canned right. And with this Asian carp, it's very, very white fish. Sucker is very white fish once we get the dark out. So how we take the dark out is this is actually kind of like a V-shaped muscle that runs right along the back. And so I'm going to come in here with a fillet knife, and I'm just going to cut like a V shape through the middle of this fillet. And you can see I took most of that red out in that V-shaped strip. What's left on the surface is just a surface muscle, and I can come in a real shallow move with my fillet knife, and I can trim that out. So I trim the red meat out. I'm left with a nice white piece of fillet. The problem with Asian carp is this is full of bones, okay? And so I can actually, there are some trimming methods that I can trim boneless meat out of here and fry it and eat it fried. But for the canning process, what we do, I'll clean this other piece up, is once we clean this, what we do is we simply come in here and we chunk it up. We cut across that bone in about 1/2-inch increments. You can actually, you'll hear those bones crunch when we cut them. And then what we do is we tightly pack a pint jar with just that fish, add a tablespoon or teaspoon of salt, and then we can this under pressure, 10 pounds of pressure for 100 minutes for a pint. If you're using quarts, it's more like 2 hours, 120 to 140 minutes. Well, I like to use pints. Don't use any water because there's plenty of water in that. What happens is these bones, under that pressure and timing, and you probably don't realize that your tuna and that has bones in it too, but the canning process melts those bones. So the bones actually melt and become soft, and you just mix it up into salmon patties or fish patties, fish salad like tuna salad. We eat that several different ways with this canned fish. But that fish is cleaner tasting than any tuna you will eat. If we would have called those Asian whitefish instead of Asian carp, people would have a lot less of a negative connotation to actually eating the Asian carp. But we call them carp, so people automatically think, oh, you're eating carp. But canning fish, we can can any kind of fish we want to that way. We can can bluegill, we can can bass, we can can catfish. But that gives you a lot of shelf life and ready to use. You can open this, take it with you on a fishing trip, open it, pour the liquid off, and eat it on crackers and saltines. and it's good just out of the container. So that's fish canning. Again, 10 pounds of pressure for 100 minutes, tight pack, leave about half an inch of head space, a teaspoon of salt, and that's the recipe for canned fish. So, any questions about fish cleaning, fish canning?
Dave, I'll ask you one to get it started. When we think about, proper food safety, I cook a lot with chicken, make a lot of fried chicken. You can only leave meat out for so long. So let's say I go fishing at 2 p.m. How long, what is your advice for transportation methods to safely get the fish from the pond into your fridge or to be cut up and processed?
All right. The reason I love to ice fish is there's a ready-made cooler. I pull it out of the hole, I put it on the ice, it's already in the cooler. That's why I like to collect most of the fish I freeze and clean for the year and put in the freezer through the ice, but we don't have a lot of ice fishing. So the best wet method in a summer, springtime situation is keep those fish alive. So have a basket where you put them in a basket, they're still alive in the pond, and you really don't have that fish starting to die until you transition and take it home. If you've got a long trip home, more than 10 or 15 minutes, have a cooler and some ice with you. So those fish go from being alive in a cooler with ice. As soon as that fish dies, that meat starts to soften. And it's not that it goes bad extremely quickly, but some species soften extremely fast. Asian carp, for instance. As soon as that fish dies and you fillet that fish, that meat starts to soften extremely, extremely quickly. I can come around here if we're just doing this part. So it becomes soft, and when it's soft, the texture changes, and it's not as palatable when it becomes soft. So have a game plan. Keep them alive as long as you can. Keep them alive. Keep them on ice in a cooler. Clean them as soon as you can. The fresher those fish are, the better. But people say, well, will you clean them? If you get home in 10 minutes, you start cleaning fish, are some of them still alive? Well, yeah, some of them are actually still alive. For extensive presentations, I do not cut through a live fish anymore because I did that years ago in Indianapolis in a program and 3 people passed out. Purdue called me very happy with the fact that 3 people passed out at my presentation, and I guaranteed them I would never cut through a live fish again in public. So the fresher they are, the easier they are to clean. Don't worry about messing this process up. People say, well, I'm going to mess some fish up. Well, yeah. If you're going to keep 500 bluegill, I guarantee you the time you cleaned 500 to 1,000 bluegill, you're going to be better at it when you finish 500 bluegill than when you started. So just go in there, keep the knife sharp, have a sharpening stone. The sharper the knife, the easier it is to clean. Always cut away from you. If you saw my system, my hand was on the side of the fish and I was always cutting away. Do never bring that knife back to your hand so it doesn't slip. There are gloves, there's flay gloves out there to put on your hand you're holding the fish on. When I do this with kids actually going to be here to learn to fish, everyone has a flay glove on, so it's a protective glove, so in case the knife slips, they're not going to cut themselves. So if you're just learning how to flay fish, Walmart, any tackle store, they tend to have flay gloves out there that you can buy. It's a good investment if you're going to clean fish. I wear a glove when I clean fish at home. Simply because it gives me a way to hold the fish a little more secure. And I just gotten used to wearing a glove. So any other questions?
Remember, if you can't unmute your mic, feel free to throw a question in the chat and we'll answer one.
So I'll show you with the bubble blade. It runs a little quicker. It's actually got a double riveted blade. These blades, if they start not cutting well, sometimes they'll get a scale in between the blades and you take them apart and rinse them. The bubble blade has 2 grommets in it that help keep the blades together. what that took, 25 seconds, 30 seconds. You can clean a lot of fish with an electric knife, a lot more efficient than you can with a fillet knife. At home, my wife's sitting there with a fillet knife. She's my ribber, so she cuts my ribs out. So all I'm doing is doing the first section, she's doing the second to help me out. And like I said, we'll average cleaning 2 to 3 fish a minute is what we average when we're working. So it's very efficient way to clean fish. Fish are healthy, a lot of omega-3s, good healthy protein. All of our farm ponds in general are very clean farm ponds. There's not a lot of worry about fish advisory. We'll talk a little bit about fish advisory real quick, because we're right here on the river in Dearborn County. Years ago, individual saw me on the ramp and I had some white perch and some channel cat, and he said, "Oh my God, you're going to take fish home from the river?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, there's a fish advisory." I said, "Yeah." I worked with Dr. Santerre, who helped create that fish advisory. The fish advisory is basically set up for individuals in their childbearing years. I am well past wanting to have children with my wife. And so when we talk about levels of the fish advisory for the Ohio River, the bigger the fish is, the higher their fish advisory level tends to be. The highest fish in the Ohio River for fish advisory are the carp. The bigger carp are the top level of the fish advisory. But most of that is, again, geared towards youth whose minds and brains are still growing, still developing, or those people in their childbearing years. And a level 2, Dr. Santerre used to explain it this way: a level 2 is the same risk as if someone would smoke a cigarette a week, 1 cigarette a week. That's what a level 2 is. A level 1 is like smoking a cigarette a day. A level 3 is like smoking a cigarette a month. So hopefully that puts that fish advisory level in perspective. And some of the bluegill species, bass species out of the river, smaller channel cat, things like that, are lower and lower on that fish advisory level. Fish advisory level, if you just go to Indiana Fish Advisory, you can pull up bodies of water that you're going to fish and see what those are. But luckily, our farm ponds are so clean, most of them can be considered almost no fishery advisory. So the advisory 2 means that a pregnant lady should not eat more than 2 servings of fish caught from an advisory level of 2 in the state. In a pond, maybe that's 1 fish meal a week. And for non-childbearing years, it means eat until you're sick and lay down and take a nap. So fish advisory is important for those youth and things like that. But I just want to put in perspective what that means, especially we're right here on the Ohio River. And there are fish that can be eaten out of the Ohio River, so enjoy the resource.
Any more questions for Dave? Dave, I've got one more for you since we have you here. You obviously the fillets for bluegills are very easy to get, but they are small. If I'm hosting a fish fry for family and friends, about how many bluegills should I catch per person to feed them?
So according to how much your friends eat. I typically, when I have fish and I take it to an extension event or things like that, I typically look for about 1 pound of fillets per person. And people will generally go through the line, and then what's left over isn't left over very long, because people go through that very quickly. When we do cod for our field days and things like that, we're typically looking at about 1/2 pound to 3/4 pound. So to give you a ballpark, 1/2 pound would be 1 time through, but if people are going to sit around and eat and snack, you're probably looking at about 1 pound a person.
Thanks, Dave. Any other questions for Dave? Looks like we've got a question here on the chat. So Dave, Tracy is asking, is the fillet process the same for larger fish?
Yes. Yeah, as a matter of fact, you look here, for the Asian carp, they tend to be 15 to 20, 25 pounds. You can use they come with a lot longer blades. And the fillet knives, Rapala fillet knives, these are 7-inch, 8-inch fillet knives. They make them all the way up to 12 or 14. So you want to use a knife based on the size of the fish. But yeah, this fish cleaning technique with electric knives and fillet knives work with big fish, salmon, trout, big catfish, and the skinning process even works for catfish. A lot of people would be surprised you can use an electric knife to take the skin off of a catfish, but I try not to be hard and down against the skin because of that red layer of meat. I like to take that out, so I actually have that electric knife help me take a lot of that out, and I leave it on the skin. So, but yes, it works. This technique works for all fish.
And then Vicky here is asking, do you have a batter recipe you like?
Yeah, I actually like Mary Kay, J.R. Matt's fish breading. I know John's seen that because we use it on our field days. It's a very complete, good balanced mix. It has a little bit of cornmeal, a little bit of cracker meal, good spices. But it can be everything from, in the old days before I used that, I'd take a roll of Ritz crackers, turn them into Ritz cracker flour, put a cup of flour in there and salt and pepper and a little bit of garlic powder, and that was my breading. So some people like cornmeal and flour. Whatever spices you like. If you like a thin coat, you can actually just bread the fish fillet like this, and we'll have a thin coating of breading on it. If you want that coating to be thicker, you can use an egg and milk wash. And if you want it even thicker, because you really like thick breading, you can actually take flour, put the fillet like this into flour, dredge it in flour a little bit, put it in egg and milk wash, and then put it in your butter, and you almost get a double coating of breading. So if you really like it heavily breaded, use a little flour, egg and milk wash, and then you're breading, and you get even a thicker coating. These fillets can be baked. They can be broiled, they can be grilled. You can use those fillets any way you want to.
I'm sure everyone, even though we're still here in the morning, is getting pretty hungry. Any last questions for Dave here before we all go run down to get some fish? All right, well, as always, I want to thank everyone for attending. This video will be recorded. It's being recorded right now, and it'll be on our YouTube channel. Just search Purdue Extension, Dearborn County on YouTube. You will also see links in my newsletter as well as on the Dearborn County Soil and Water Conservation District site. I'd like to thank Vicki Riggs here with Dearborn County Soil and Water for helping organize the event and for being such a good partner all the time. I'd also like to take a special note to say part of what we did today is thanks to the Dearborn County Foundation. We just installed a new video system here at our office. So I'd like to thank the Community Foundation for their part in allowing us to use this new technology. I never thought I'd be able to offer a bird's eye view of Dave Osborne's famous fish programs, but we did that today. So this will be on YouTube for everyone to view. If you have any additional questions, reach out to us or your county extension educator or the County Soil and Water District. But with that, I'd like to thank Alex again, and have a great day, everyone.